Okay, so analysing the game between Arsenal and Chelsea. Obviously, Arsenal just lost, but before we jump into the analysis, I want to try a little bit of an experiment. In the coming games, I think it would be better actually if you think that there's a fixture that we should focus on, given we don't have like the amount of resources, places like the Athletic, etc., to be able to analyse every team. It'd be really good if you left down in the comments below which fixtures you thought were the most interesting to analyse tactically. Also, I've got a surprise coming up where I'm going to focus a bit more on data in a few upcoming videos, but it's going to be on more historical matches. I'll explain that soon, hopefully. So yeah, look forward to that, and don't forget, leave your comments down below which matches you think are most interesting tactically. Arsenal, at home up against Chelsea able to unveil their $100 million signing. Obviously there's a lot of hope, but then also despair with Arsenal. They do kind of fluctuate really wildly between the two. You see that in the way that the fans react to what's happening on the pitch. I personally think that you have to have a little bit of realism when it comes to Arsenal now. This isn't the Arsenal of 5-10 years ago, competing against the Chelsea, Manchester United, the Liverpool of 5-10 years ago, where the resources gap wasn't as significant. Now the resource gap is gigantic, and I think you have to keep that in mind. I know we don't like to talk about that, but I do think that's important. So whilst Arsenal did lose this overall, I still think at times they played quite nice football. I think we should start with their attack. They were very intent on trying to force mistakes out of Chelsea, especially at the back, whether that was centre-back, centre midfielders or goalkeepers. So you saw this with their pressing on Chelsea's short goal kicks, but also on trying to force a mistake out of Mendy as well. When they tried to press, they tried in a number of different formations. I do think that all of them suffered from the same problem, but they tried a 4-2-2-2, they tried a 4-2-3-1, they tried a 4-1-4-1. So initially it's a 4-2-3-1, but the problem is that all of the pressing that Arsenal do falls down out in the wide spaces. Chelsea are really happy in trying to progress the ball from the back to the front by using their centre midfielders in Kovacic and Jorginho, who are really difficult to get off the ball just because of how good they are at those really simple 1-2s to get the ball up the pitch. So Chelsea would be able to play out into their wide centre-back, so there's Azpilicueta are really good, typically more than Azpilicueta's side, and then they could use the fact that Jorginho's on that side as a point to pass between Azpilicueta, get past the press, and then into the higher position, whether it was Mount dropping or Havertz dropping, or whether it was James in that side. They'd be able to just get around the Arsenal press, and then suddenly Chelsea have potentially 5 people running at the back line of Arsenal. So Arsenal had the various shapes that I mentioned, so the 4-2-3-1, 4-1-4-1, 4-2-2-2. So the 4-2-3-1 was the original, but as I said, there's a little bit of a problem there in that eventually the wing back for Chelsea will end up free, or if they're not free, then you'll end up with the wide forward of Chelsea being free, because of the fact that they'll pull out into the space vacated by Arsenal's fullback pressing high up against the wing backs of Chelsea. That presents a problem because it exposes the centre midfielders or centre back of Arsenal to go out into those wide spaces and try and defend up against the relatively quick and obviously nimble Havertz or Mount. Arsenal tried to counter this by at times having the centre midfielders track the wide forward. So you'd see earlier on in the game Xhaka or Sambi tracking those two forwards, but after a while they realised how much that was pulling apart the centre midfield and kind of exposing the centre backs, because once Chelsea did pull those two centre midfielders away, it meant that Lukaku was there free to be able to receive the ball to feet and then obviously spin from there and launch it out to whether it was marauding right wing back or left wing back, and you had a serious problem. Arsenal tried something else, so they tried the 4-1-4-1 where, and again this might not be actually a dramatic move away from the 4-2-3-1, it could just be more what I saw, but basically on occasion you see Sambi or Lokonga higher up the pitch, and he would try and put pressure just generally higher, whether it was on Kovacic, and then obviously you'd have Smith Rowe putting pressure on Jorginho to try and prevent them being able to facilitate the progression up the pitch in the manner that I mentioned earlier. That was still a problem because you still had the wide forwards being able to pick up those pockets either side, but behind the four in midfield of Arsenal. So then Arsenal also tried the 4-2-2-2, where the forwards and centre midfielders would narrow and just basically try and congest the centre of the pitch to make it really, really difficult for Jorginho and Kovacic to be able to help facilitate that progression. But then the problem then comes in how wide Chelsea's team can be, obviously with wing backs, you can really stretch the play. So it meant that, yes, you could really press Chelsea towards one side, but then they would have the ability to be able to switch it to whoever was free on the far side of their team. Obviously, throughout this game, that was often Reece James. So no matter what Arsenal did, they really struggled generally to be able to press Chelsea. There was a brief period where I think they did relatively well in the second half, and on occasion, I think that came from Arsenal's wide forward pressing and then boxing in the Chelsea back line and centre back. So I think Martinelli did it very well at times. Okay, so other means of attack for Arsenal were wide overloads, typically on the left-hand side. They didn't have very much possession. I think it was 65-35 in favour of Chelsea, so very rarely in possession. But when they did have possession, they would sometimes work it on the right-hand side, just so that then they could pull Chelsea across to that side and then make a switch. And you'd have Tierney quite high up on that left-hand side to support Saka and try and whip in across. Conversely, on the right-hand side, Cedric was not really marauding up the pitch at all. So to create a little bit more space for Tierney, Saka would sometimes drop from his inside left wing position, and then that would try and draw out Azpilicueta and create a little bit more of a favourable position or channel for Tierney to be able to try and exploit. Honourable mention for corners. I think Holding had one good chance from a corner. Overall, I don't think the corners came to too much. And then also you should mention the counter-attacking. So on quite a few occasions, Arsenal were able to try and break out into the wide spaces, facilitated by the fact that Chelsea, in sustained possession, will move to kind of a one centre-back deep, that being like Eriksen, and then you have two or one holding midfielder. So at times it was Kovacic with Jorginho ahead, later on it was Jorginho with Kante ahead, but you'd have one sitting centre midfielder or two, and then you'd have the two wide centre-backs, so Rudiger and Azpilicueta, and then ahead of them the rest of the team, obviously with the wing-backs holding the width, and the two kind of number 10s or number 8s like floating in their respective sides, or sometimes also both pulling over to one side and trying to combine on that side too. But that did mean that in those wide spaces behind the wide centre-backs, if Arsenal were able to kind of connect a couple of passes to beat Chelsea's counter-press, then it did mean that there was a lot of space to exploit. And I think there was a couple of really good chances for Arsenal. One of them was the Martinelli chance, but that was blocked. I'd say it's a chance. He ended up having his shot blocked by Azpilicueta, so it's not as if it was, hurtling towards goal and it was like a last ditch thing, but it was really good compared to a lot of the other opportunities that they had in the rest of the game. And then also I mentioned the Aubameyang chance around like the 64th minute, 65th minute, and again, he never had a shot on this occasion. It was swept by Mendy, but there it was really close. That's fine margins between potentially having a really high XG chance and not, and that just came from Arsenal being able to beat the Chelsea press. Okay, so on to Chelsea's defence. So we've mentioned the main aspects with regards to the counter pressing and the shapes that they typically did that in, I guess. And then I guess the other details maybe to mention that their shape was typically a 5-2-1-2, a 5-2-3, or later on what seemed like a 5-3-2. So those changes in formation, the 5-2-1-2 and the 5-2-3, at times you'd have Mount kind of drop into a CAM position. But then obviously later on, once they had a couple of substitutions and it ended up with Werner and Lukaku leading the line, then they had those two sit up top and you had just the three in midfield. Okay, so Chelsea's attack, we already talked about Arsenal's press and how Chelsea beat that progressive ball up the pitch. So that gives you one idea of how Chelsea attacked. But then another avenue being in sustained possession. We talked again about the formation that Chelsea had in sustained possession, and typically they were looking to try and cross mostly from the right-hand side. Left-hand side I think was a little bit more trying to drive into the box. I think there's some really silky touches by Kai Havertz in that left-hand space, but on the right-hand side I'd say it was preferable that they cross from there. So you've got James there who's going to try and get to the dead ball line and then whip a ball in behind the defence when he can, or also cut it back and just generally take advantage of that position high up on the right-hand side in his obviously wicked delivery. But then also you can, with how aggressively positioned the wide centre-backs for Chelsea are, pull the ball back and then have Azpilicueta whip it in. There's shades of Azpilicueta to Morata from a couple of seasons ago with obviously in this case Azpilicueta whipping it in for Lukaku. There was a really good chance for Lukaku of one of these crosses, I think, but Leno was able to tip it onto the crossbar. But if that's signs of things to come, I think Chelsea fans will be really excited. And that concludes how Chelsea attacked. So with that, we're going to move on to the goal analysis. having a look at the goal scored in the 15th minute by Romelu Lukaku, really great goal. Obviously, this is just a symptom of the things that I mentioned earlier with regards to the deficiencies in Arsenal's press. So, initially Chelsea had the ball relatively deep with Jorginho and Kovacic, and it seems quite safe. But the issue is just how free they are, how easily they're able to beat this initial part of the press. I think a big culprit for me here is Pepe. So you see Pepe standing off of Kovacic, standing off of Rudiger. He's not really injecting any pace, and again, you could also point out to the rest of the midfield too. Obviously, this is high intensity, in that it's the Premier League, and if you sit off, everyone is punished. So I definitely think that this is the first problem. Okay, so then the ball is fired into Romelu Lukaku by Kovacic. This goes to what I mentioned earlier, where the two centre midfielders of Arsenal have tracked the wide forwards who split for Chelsea, and then that leaves a really nice avenue to pass into Romelu Lukaku, and then from there the rest of the Arsenal defensive line have to narrow. Obviously Mari has tried to track Lukaku, but then that means that there's now space behind Mari for the Chelsea wide forwards to try and exploit. You see that here with the run of Mason Mount, but then obviously that leaves a ton of space out wide for James or Alonso on the other side. So when inevitably James gets the ball out wide, you see here that also Alonso's super high up the pitch. Eventually he will end up free. Again here, Mari has tried to muscle or just knock Lukaku off stride. Obviously Lukaku's going to be faster than Mari anyway, so Mari is kind of screwed. Even if he doesn't try and do the impossible and out muscle Lukaku, I think he's still going to have a problem. See, James is already behind the defensive line, so literally Lukaku only has to just get beyond Mari and it's a goal. Obviously Tierney has had to narrow because of the earlier issue that we mentioned with Lukaku being able to drop off and Mari having to track, which then forced Tierney to tuck inside to track the runner of or track the run of Mount. So yeah, it's really difficult to see how you fix this without Arsenal just conceding a lot of ground, so just accepting, okay, we can't press. Chelsea, we just don't have the pressing intelligence as well as the intensity to be able to do it. Or I think you change formation. Tierney is on the pitch as well as Saka, so you do technically have a left-sided centre-back and a left wing-back, so you can kind of change formation here to match up with Chelsea, and that prevents a little bit of this ambiguity in who's meant to pick up who. Maybe moving to that kind of shape isn't something that they planned for, so whilst I suggest it, I do see that there could be potential problems with that too, but that obviously reduces the ambiguity of who's meant to pick up who, and also allows the wing-backs to just kind of drag each other without there being, again, that ambiguity between whether it's meant to be a wide midfielder or a centre midfielder or a fullback. And again, you can just point to the fact that earlier during the game, when the wing backs picked up these really difficult to pick up positions, the Arsenal fullback was having to press and run and close the gap of maybe 10 yards, 5 yards. That's a ton of time for the wing back to be able to hurt them. So for me, there's potential other things you can do. Obviously Arsenal did try a whole bunch, but like I said, every single solution fell to the issue of Chelsea's wing backs, wide forward,